Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments, and you command us to engage in the give and take, the back and forth, the business of learning Torah. So, as I said in my perhaps overly long introduction, we are going to dive back into Art Green's wonderful little book called A Guide to the Zohar as a way of sort of giving ourselves a decent background for studying Zohar at some point. And studying Zohar is, I think, a good way for us to begin to get some of the meat of Jewish mysticism. And Jewish mysticism, as I've talked about at other times, is similar to other mystical systems in that it is an attempt to connect profoundly with mystery, right? To have a profound inner experience that we then identify as connected to some universal experience or some deeper universal mystery. So some connection between how we feel on the inside and whatever we call God is externally, internally. So that's the mystical experience. The Jewish flip side of this, and Professor Rabbi Green is going to talk about this, is we also expect a Jewish mystic to be a righteous person, to behave in a way that conforms with ethics. We also use language and storytelling to get us into that because we don't presume that the story that we tell about my mystical experience is going to transfer one-to-one to you. We expect it to be a teaching story where maybe each of us say, oh, I get one of these things. This sounds like it might click with me. But there's no way, again, for me to give you my experience of mystery. I can't. Because we are all uniquely and infinitely varied, and therefore your experience is going to be uniquely and infinitely varied, as is mine, and therefore they're never going to be exactly the same. Right? So we are not mystics like Mormons, right? Who feel that I've had an experience of God in my life and I'm going to go knock on your door and I'm going to tell you about it and you're going to have exactly the same experience. That is not a Jewish way of doing things. So instead, we're going to sort of dive into this deep sea of Jewish mysticism and Talmud and stories. Now, and Bob says, how do I know when I have a mystical experience? This is a good question. So the answer, I would say, is those moments in our lives. I mean, this is my definition. So except that it's personal, and we're attempting to take the personal and making general, and we always get into trouble when we do that. So a mystical experience is a personal experience of profound meaning. So when things click into place in some deep way. So I spent a good part of this last Shabbat attempting to teach our 7-year-old how to ski. And Sadie is a very opinionated, determined, and individualistic person, not unlike anyone else in her family. And therefore, we found a couple of weeks ago when I tried to do this and put her into a lesson that it didn't work. So I'm a decent skier, so I decided to work with her. And I worked with her on falling and directing skis and all this stuff. And eventually, what really happened that was amazing is I held out our poles, not the way you normally do, but like a single bar. And she held onto them, and I skied backwards and she skied forwards so that I could help her figure out how to do it. And there were a couple of moments of beautiful near perfection where skiing happened. Right? Where I was going down and she was getting it, and it was like in that moment, the mystery became clear. So that, as far as I'm concerned, is a profound mystical experience in its own way. A deep connection between me and somebody I love, and an activity where we are doing it together. And of course, Elise, it was absolutely my connection with her. So that says, and that's why I chose that experience as opposed to sort of my individual solo experiences of experiencing nature, because for me, it's all of the above, right? There are times when we can have an individual experience of spiritual. Yes, you can't teach riding a bicycle this way. No, and I have tried. I run alongside. I can't quite run backwards quickly enough to hold the handlebars in front of me while she does it. I have to be on the side. Fortunately, my skiing backwards is better than my biking backwards, or unicycling backwards. I suppose if I were a good unicyclist, I could unicycle backwards in front of Sadie while she cycled, but I'm not that good. Meaning I don't unicycle at all, don't get any. Anyway, so if that's the goal, to a certain extent, what we're saying is a mystical encounter is an encounter that deepens meaning in our lives. And we have an entire literature about how to live more deeply, how to find greater meaning. In just the same way that I can't give you the feeling of what it's like to ski backwards while my daughter skis in front of me, right? I can explain it to you a little bit, and through the miracle of Zoom, you can see that I have an emotional connection to it because my face and my voice are animated. That's not going to give you anything in the way of a roadmap as to how to have a mystical experience yourself. You can say, oh, that's Jonathan's and Sadie's inner lives writ large, but that doesn't help me. So think of Jewish mysticism as an attempt for me to say, okay, if I were to distill this down to a general language of encounter, can I come up with some principles that would help other people find this experience on their own? And that's the exercise. How do I help other people, if I'm the writer of the Zohar, encounter each other in a more meaningful way, and in so doing, encounter God in a teaching, nourishing way that allows us to be better as people and better in society? And in this particular way, what's fundamentally Jewish about this take is that that's the mission of Torah as well, right? The mission of Torah is to figure out how to help us all get along better. And it focuses on laws, on rules, and the constant updating of the rules of a family, and then a society, and then a monarchy, and the failures of those rules over time, and then the reinterpretation and reapplication of them. So Jewish mysticism is an extension of that call it the micro-macro level. Yeah, so Amalia says it's like the person who watches you and Sadie from a short distance. Right, they're trying to generalize what's good about this and say, okay, how does that work? Or more importantly, how can I take a principle of what this guy skiing backwards with his daughter is doing and use it as a way of teaching my kid how to ski? And turns out it's not so easy, because the moment that I reached with Sadie, which I would call when it kind of clicked, was the result of hours of experimentation on the snow with her, and years of getting to know her and figuring out and failing often to figure out what worked and what didn't work. So taking, and this is really one of the key elements of Jewish thinking, how do we learn from a specific experience a general principle? And this is a key logical point in studying Talmud, right? What's teachable from a small thing to the general. And Susan says correctly, I don't know if it's conscious, but being present, absolutely. And Elise says, yes, absolutely. It can be experienced with little things like reading to Sadie each night. You will have no idea. Absolutely, that's perfect, right? Yeah, an aha moment, says Bob, is a mystical experience. Absolutely. The history that I have reading to Sadie regularly is part of our fundamental connection. Today, I just finished reading, she's home from school, as I was saying earlier, I just finished reading the last chapter of the second Harry Potter book to her. And one of the funny things, and you know, she's reading some books on her first chapter books, Magic Treehouse, she's reading on her own now. But now she's also watched all the Harry Potter movies. So one of the big bits of our conversation is a meta conversation. Isn't this so much cooler than what happened in the movie? Right? How is the book better than the movie? Is the question. But all of those things rolled into one. I can't give you that. I can give you the sense of it. So let's look, we're going to look at the history of Jewish mysticism as a way of trying to understand what Jews have said about how to do this on a general principle as opposed to a specific encounter. So we're going to look, we're going back to Art Green's book, and we're going to read together. And as I said last night when I teased this, this is perhaps the driest material that I have brought forward to this group ever. So I apologize in advance. We're going to attempt to make it interesting despite its aridity, because it's history. So, and of course, a brief history, according to Rabbi Art Green, is still only 20 pages. And this is the Kabbalistic tradition, a brief history until the Zohar, right? So this is a brief history of Jewish mysticism up until the Middle Ages. All right, so here he starts out, Jewish mysticism of the Middle Ages is a rereading of earlier Jewish tradition, including both the Bible and the corpus of rabbinic literature. So the corpus of rabbinic literature, what do we mean by that? So biblical literature runs historically from the 10th century BCE, from the 9th century, from around the time of the Kingdom of Solomon, when we imagine Jews or Israelites first writing stuff down, all the way through around the 1st century CE. In other words, the writing of the Bible is a 1,000-year project. They are still arguing about which books get in and don't get in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, in what we would call the early rabbinic period. And it is at that time, for example, that the books that are part of the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha get rejected, right? So books like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, all the books of the Maccabees, are not kept by Jews. They are kept by early Christians. The rabbis of that time period, the late Jewish sages, early rabbis say, they're not our books. We don't like them. They're not part of our canon. So that process is still happening. So the corpus of rabbinic literature starts at that time. Formerly, the corpus of rabbinic literature starts with the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is written between 100 and 200 CE. Informally, the corpus of rabbinic literature starts with Midrash. Now, Midrash are definitely told about biblical stories from the beginning of the biblical period, but they don't get written down until the end of the rabbinic period. So if you can imagine, we've been telling stories about what we wrote in the Bible from the moment we wrote it. In other words, the stuff that we wrote in the Bible was often a trigger to talk about the stuff that we just talked about. Think of it as kind of the PowerPoint presentation. that what got written down in the Bible was the stuff that we wrote to as a catalyst to talk about the other stuff that we were thinking about. We don't write that other oral stuff down until the end of the rabbinic period around the 5th and 6th century, between 400 and 600, which is when we date the collections of Midrash, of interpretive stories, which are called things like Bereshit Rabbah and Shmot Rabbah. So there's so that's part of the corpus of rabbinic literature. But the big corpus of rabbinic literature, the formal bit, is Mishnah, which was written, completed in around 200, and Talmud, the two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud completed around 350, and the Babylonian Talmud finished around 600. So when he says Jewish mysticism of the Middle Ages is a rereading of earlier Jewish tradition, including both the Bible and the corpus of rabbinic literature, he is saying that it is a rereading of nearly 1,500 years of literature. Because, when we do projects, we don't do them small or rushed. Okay, it has to be understood in the context of the great project of medieval Jewry as a whole, the interpretation of a received, authoritative, and essentially complete body of normative Jewish teaching. So when we're talking about Jewish mysticism in the Middle Ages, it follows along the lines of other Jewish medieval thinkers to be a whole system. In other words, every piece of literature that came before is somehow informing it. Now, here you can see some of the Jewish elitism making this difficult to read. Right? If I were to throw you into the Zohar and say, okay, you can't read the Zohar unless you've read everything about the Bible and the rabbis beforehand to understand it, you're like, well, forget it. I can't do that then. And I would be like that too. So instead, what we're saying is, let's flip that on its head and say, open it up. I can read the Zohar, and anything that was ever written before the Zohar might be applicable. I don't need to know it, but knowing something that came before will enhance my knowing afterwards. Again, I don't need to have the measurements of the mountain off to the side down to the centimeter, but anything I know about that mountain will help me on my way. So we can go from need to know to nice to know. It's nice to know all this stuff. I'm still going to get something out of this, even if I don't know it all. This body of teaching canonized in the Gaonic Age. So what is the Gaonic Age? He says from the 8th to 10th centuries. So that's from the 700s to the 900s. The Gaonim, the geniuses, are the first comprehensive commenters on Talmud. And so they are scholars of that early medieval period. So this body of teaching, canonized at that time, so nominally commanded the loyalty of all Jewry with the exception of a Karaite minority. So the Karaites were the people who rejected all of rabbinic literature. They had their own take, and they didn't like it. They didn't like the rabbis, and it's a whole other story. But the deeper attachment of Jews to this tradition had to be re-won constantly, especially in the face of both Christian and Jewish polemics against Judaism, ever the religious culture of a threatened minority living in the shadow of one or the other of its giant offspring. So one of the things that we as 21st century Jews have trouble with is the idea that there was ever a time that the things that we accept as normal in Judaism weren't accepted as normal by everybody. What do I mean by this? So at this time period, both the rabbis of the Talmud and the rabbis of that culture and the teachers of this mystical tradition are still arguing to make it Jewish. the idea that there is a minority of people who disagree with it gives us this sense, right? We think that somehow or another, the great controversy of multiple Jewish movements is something that is only created in the last 250 years. We've been arguing about how to do Judaism from the time Moses came down and said, "Why are you building a golden calf?" We have been a sectarian, divisive people, intra-Jewish from the get-go. And we see those arguments in the Torah, and we see those arguments throughout the rest of biblical civilization. And we see those arguments at this time where the rabbis are not just arguing with the Christian and Muslim critiques of Judaism, but they're also arguing with Jewish critics of Judaism to justify that their Judaism is the right Judaism to go forward. So increasingly, various new intellectual currents that came into fashion among the Jews also occasioned the need for defense or reinterpretation of the tradition, right? So we've got all this stuff, this brew going on around, and we have to decide what to do with it. And this is what I mean. Here is a word that you don't need to remember. These included Mutazilite philosophy, right? So here's a footnote to explain it, and then you can forget about it. So here's a word, don't worry about it. The earliest form of philosophic rationalism adopted by Jewish thinkers in the 10th century based on Islamic models. So this is in the 900s, there is a philosophical rationalism going on in the Gaonic period. It's called Mutazilite. Forget it, we're going to turn the page. Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism, those words you may know. Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism are two brands of medieval philosophy that really took hold in the Muslim world, and therefore were majorly influential on the Jews living under Islam. The classic form for such reinterpretation of authoritative texts was the commentary, whether on one or more books of the Bible or on a part of the Talmudic legacy. Kabbalah, a new sort of mystical esoteric exegesis that first appeared in the 12th century, may be seen as another medieval rereading of the received Jewish canon. So this is very important because this is our context here. All these other things, sorry for the blurriness there, all these other things are happening in the Jewish world, trigger reinterpretation and rethinking. When we get rationalism, Jews look at our own texts and they say, how are we rationalists? When we get Neoplatonism, which identifies a whole system of thinking about what's physical and what's theoretical and the connection between the two and a spiritual underpinning to it all, we as Jews say, how are we Neoplatonic? And when in the 12th century, in the 1100s, we have the beginning of a literature that's commenting on how to be mystics, Jews take that very seriously, and they incorporate it as a way of looking at everything Jewish up until that point. So the Zohar and the mystical traditions of the Zohar become a rereading, a reinterpreting of everything Jewish prior to that point. If you think this is a big undertaking, understand that this is what we do as Jews. When we encounter something new, we say, is it useful to my Judaism? Especially if it's convincing. So astrophysics, quantum mechanics, is it useful to my Judaism? Turns out it is. Because the idea that everything is connected at a quantum level is a physical representation of a physical theoretical representation of a spiritual idea that we have in Judaism. That all things are connected because they're all created by God. That doesn't mean that Judaism anticipated quantum mechanics, but rather quantum mechanics helps us describe something that we feel Jewishly. In other words, what Jews do is we are not bound by everything that came before us Jewishly to stick with it and reject other things. Rather, what we do is we say, oh, that's a great insight. How do I use it in making my Judaism better? How do I take something from outside Judaism, from the secular world, from another religious, how do I take Buddhist meditation and make it Jewish? It turns out it's pretty easy. Because Jews have a meditative tradition, we have tons of powerful symbols and we can use them. All right, to understand the ways in which Kabbalah, and particularly the Zohar, finds its home within the earlier tradition, we need to distinguish 5 elements that are present in the legacy that medieval Jews received from the Judaism of the Talmudic age. Although these 5 are not all equal, either in the amount of text devoted to them or in the degree of formal authority with which they are accredited, each plays an important role in the new configuration of Judaism that Kabbalah represents. So, when I was looking ahead and I was thinking, do I really need to throw my friends into all this history? I realized that we couldn't really go forward without using Rabbi Green's 5 elements here. So we have to understand what these 5 elements here. So here I'm showing a difference. That Hebrew term from the first page, forget about it. Unimportant. These 5 elements, we're going to keep coming back to. We don't need to remember them every time because we're not doing this for graduate credit, right? This isn't a master's level course or even an undergrad level course. However, take note, and like anything that we read over and over again, if you're going to spend some time expanding our vocabulary, here are 5 things worth paying attention to. They're closer than the far off mountain. They're more like things that we're going to see regularly along the way. The first we've already been talking about, even if you haven't noticed. The first of the 5 elements is Agadah, the narrative tradition contained in the Talmud and the various works of Midrash. Now, for those of you who are sensitive to the next holiday coming up in the Jewish calendar, you might think, Agadah and Haggadah, aren't these words connected? And they are. Agadah is the narrative tradition, and Haggadah is the retelling, right? The formal story that we tell. So yes, they both have the same root in Hebrew. And the Talmud is a lot of stuff, and the Midrash is even more stuff. And the Aggadic tradition is the storytelling parts to be found in both. So think of Agadah as the way Jews retell and interpret stories all the way through our tradition. And then, Rabbi Green is going to use some highfalutin vocabulary, right? Midrash is a hermeneutical term, renderable both as inquiry and homiletics, indicating a way of delving into scripture that tends toward fanciful and extended rereadings. Hermeneutical, essential, qualitative term. So Midrash means inquiry, or homiletics, which is just a way of saying a sermon, right? A Midrash is either a way of explaining something or a way of telling us what the explanation is about. A Midrash that is a storytelling thing is the Midrash about Abraham breaking the idols. So we have a story about how Abraham broke idols in his father's shop. This is a story that is primarily one we tell as a homiletic purpose. It's got a sermon in it. The sermon in it is answering the question, why does God start talking to Abraham in the next section? And the answer is because Abraham breaks idols. Abraham doesn't believe God is in idols, and therefore God recognizes Abraham's insight into the world, and God starts talking to Abraham. There's another classic homiletic, sort of sermon-like midrash, also from the same same section of the Torah, but a little bit earlier, about Noah. In the time of Noah, there are two Hebrew words, often translated as violence and corruption, that are used to explain why God wants to destroy the world. Right? God is ready to start over. And God described the world is described as corrupt and violent. Rashi, in the around 1100, reinterprets those words and says those words actually mean sexual indiscretions and petty theft. That's right. Rashi is giving a sermon on Parshat Noah in Genesis, on the Parsha where Noah comes and says, all of you people think that there was some great violence and corruption, but no, it's exactly the things that I keep on telling you not to do. You know, petty theft and unfairness in business and sexual indiscretion. That's why God destroyed the world. Be good or God will do it again, right? I mean, you know, it's a fire and brimstone sermon. That's a midrashic take too, right? So we have these two ways of taking these different ways of taking our biblical stories and retelling them in a way to either explain something or to get a point across. So that's inquiry and homiletics. And as Rabbi Green will continue, much of Agadah is legendary in content, expanding biblical history and recreating the biblical landscape in the settings of the rabbinic world. But Agadah also includes tales of the rabbis themselves and teachings of wisdom in many forms, maxims, parables, folk traditions, and so forth. It's the stuff that makes Judaism fun, right? Midrash, the legendary tradition, the folk telling tradition, this is the stuff that really has like all this really cool, the stuff that says, oh, there's like a fanciful, fable-like essence to Judaism. It's not so dry, right? And, you know, for all intents and purposes, I just used the Midrashic Agadic tradition by telling you two stories that sound somewhat familiar to help us make this history less dry, right? That's the purpose of the Agadah. So why is this our first element? It's our first element because Rabbi Green says the Kabbalists made great use of the Midrashic Agadic tradition, drawing on both its methods of interpretation and its contents. The hermeneutical assumptions of Midrash, the legitimacy of juxtaposing verses from anywhere within Scripture without concern for dating or context, the rearrangement of words or even occasional substitution of letters, the use of numerology and abbreviation as ways to derive meaning, the endless glorification of biblical heroes, and the tarring of villains and others. So hermeneutical assumptions, the basic assumptions of Midrash. So here is Rabbi Green's very succinct summing up of the tools that we use in storytelling. Well, somebody chatted and said, yes, we're attempting to make this a little less dry. Thank you, Bob. Moist, even. Juicy. Let's say juicy. The opposite of a dry text is a juicy text. Maybe that's what we should be using as the framework here. So these hermeneutical assumptions are the tools that Midrash uses. So first, the legitimacy of juxtaposing verses from anywhere within Scripture without concern of dating or context. So this is done all the time. Abraham serves the angels who visit Abraham milk and then meat, because Abraham has already studied Talmud with God and knows that even though the rules about kashrut have not been given yet, that one doesn't serve milk and meat together, and there's a shorter waiting period between eating milk and eating meat. So therefore, when he serves them cheese, milk and lamb, what he does is he does it in the correct order. That kind of crazy idea that the text in the Torah and the text in the Talmud and all of the texts in between are shared not just by the authors of all those texts, but by the characters in them, is a fundamental presumption of Jewish teaching in the Midrashic tradition. That, Isaiah says something that fills in the blanks of what David said 200 years beforehand, because David knew that Isaiah would say it. I've often called this, Rashi really sort of evokes this quite seriously. Rashi calls this, I call this in Rashi's words, the grand unified theory of Jewish text. That basically everything in a certain prescribed sense of Jewish canon is interdependent. It is interconnected and it is dependent on each other. And we see the Talmudic rabbis doing this all the time when they try to, when they have legal discussions, because they will say, okay, Rabbi Yosef argues with Rabbi Yehuda and says that this text doesn't mean what he says. If Rabbi Yossi is correct and it means this, then how does Rabbi Yossi teach this other thing that Rabbi Yehuda is doing? In other words, how does he make the whole system consistent? So that's a legal argument for this, which is that every text must be accounted for. It's all one unified system. And it's one unified narrative system too, which allows for both a lot of creativity and a lot of fudging. It allows even the rearrangement of words or even occasional substitution of letters. That's right. The rabbis of the Midrash and Kabbalah have no problem saying this word, if you switch a letter here, means something else, and this is what the text is actually saying. So Steve asks a long, involved question. He says, can you address attitudes towards prayer, 21st century or early days? How many say the Modeh Ani prayer and pray every day out of gratitude, giving thanks? How do you get to that place, as opposed to praying when you need something in terms of crisis or in Rosh Hashanah? Songs by John Lennon and Regina Spektor really exemplify the attitude of when many people pray or look for God. Lyrics below, God by John Lennon, God is a concept by which we measure our pain, or laughing with Regina Spektor, no one laughs at God in a hospital, no one laughs at God in a war, no one's laughing at God when they're starving or freezing, oh so very poor, right? There are also known as, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? To sum it up. How do we, in a short answer to your question, Steve, in order to evoke an attitude of gratitude, we just have to practice. It is as simple as and as difficult as doing that. Creating a habit of prayer is just that. It is not easy. It is difficult. It is difficult to make ourselves say, or as Elise says, she has a grateful list. Yes. So some people get up and write something about which they're grateful for first thing in the morning. Or say just, Modeh Ani lefanecha, I am grateful before you, Adonai, our God, first thing in the morning. Why? Because if we do it, then we become more grateful. It's good to go to bed thinking thoughts of gratitude as well, right? These habits are not natural. They are evolved. They are ones that we have to work on. I guarantee you that somebody says this is easily done is trying to sell you something to help you do it more easily. For most of us, this is a challenge, whether it is, and I have a number of spiritual habits that I try, including meditation and running, and some I'm more successful at than others. But in all of them, how we take on the idea of God is, yes, Elise says it's easier to kvetch. It's so much easier to kvetch. But in all of them, our attitude towards the divine is a developed, interactive attitude. The Jewish prayer structure is designed to help us find that. The Kabbalistic literature that we're talking about here is designed to accompany the prayer structure. These are all meant to be complementary aspects. None of them are meant to substitute for the entirety of Jewish living, right? This is why we're not looking at material from the Kabbalah Center, because material from the Kabbalah Center says all you need is Jewish mysticism. You don't need anything else. And I would never tell you that. I would never tell you, don't do this other Jewish thing. I would say all of these Jewish things have merit. Let's figure out the ones in this massive toolbox. Remember, we have a 3,000-year-old toolbox with millions of contributors. So there's no way that any one of us can use all those tools. However, that means there's a big variety. So finding the ones that work for us is a constant situation of experimentation. We encounter a tool, we pick it up, we say, this looks interesting, it might be useful. And then we try it. Yes, Amalia says it was easy to disagree with a Midrashic interpretation. It's true. One of the things that's fascinating about it is Midrash allows us to open this up to discussion. The Torah text itself, we don't argue with the nature of the text, but we can argue with the Midrashic take on the text. And since the text sometimes most of the time requires the Midrash for us to understand it, we get to argue a lot about what the text is actually saying without arguing with the text. We're just arguing with someone else's take on the text. And that's perfectly allowable. So our dialectic is, here's our fixed thing. We don't argue about whether or not the Torah is important. What the Torah says, that we can argue about all the time. Use of numerology and abbreviation as a ways to derive meaning. This is like a rabbit hole of all rabbit holes, right? If I am going to midrashically interpret a verse or a word based on numerology, I can connect anything to anything. It is only limited by the creativity of my argumentation. Because once I start interpreting words based on their numerical equivalent, right? And every Hebrew letter is viewed as a number on its own. So we can look at Hebrew letters as a word as the sum of its Hebrew letters or the sequence of its Hebrew letters. So one of the classic ones on this is the word tzitzit. Tzitzit is the word for fringes, on which we tie on the corners of a talit, of a prayer shawl. The numerical value of the word tzitzit is 600. That is, Sadi Yud Sadi is, Sadi Yud Taf comes to 300, and Sadi Yud Taf again comes to another 300. So you add those up and you get 600. And then, thank you, Steve. And then the fringes themselves have 8 threads and 5 knots. So 600 plus 8 plus 5 equals 613. Why? Because the tzitzit are supposed to remind us of the 613 commandments. So there is a numerological midrash on why we wear tzitzit. The endless glorification of biblical heroes and the tarring of villains and others. So, was David a rabbi? It's a rhetorical question. No. David was a thug. He was a very effective thug. He was an early chieftain and a killer of thousands, if not millions, of Philistines, right? For a really gruesome potential movie project, just read the passages in the books of Samuel and the books of Kings describing David's warrior-like presence. David goes out and kills lots of people very bloodily. And yet, if we read about David in the Midrash, he is the writer of the Psalms. He is an amazingly inspired scholar. He, as Amalia and Bob might remember from when we studied Talmud together, he placed a harp in his palace in such a way that at midnight, the east wind would hit it and it would play, so that when he's studying at midnight, if he had fallen asleep, he would be roused so that he would pray at midnight, because prayer at midnight is particularly powerful, right? This is not the David of the text. This is the elevation of David, and the Midrash elevates David into a warrior sage of inestimable value and proportions. So all of these things were all carried over from Midrash into Kabbalah. Indeed, many of these assumptions were used by other sorts of medieval preachers as well. But the content of the Agadic worldview, with its mythical picture of God as creator and divine ruler who sees everywhere, who acts in history, responds to prayer and human virtue, even suspending the laws of nature to rescue God's beloved, who mourns with Israel the destruction of their shared temple and suffers with them the pain of exile, all this too was faithfully carried over into the Kabbalistic imagination. In fact, the Kabbalists were partial to the most highly anthropomorphic and mythical versions of rabbinic tradition, such as those contained in the 8th century Midrashic collection Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Here they stood in sharp contrast to the other emerging intellectual trend of the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophy, which exercised a degree of critical skepticism with regard to the more fantastic claims of the Agadah, and sought out wherever possible those more modest and semi-naturalistic viewpoints that could be found among certain of the early rabbis. So this is important. What's going on in the Middle Ages, especially in Spain and in North Africa and in Egypt, is a flourishing of intellectual ideas. It, like off the charts, going in all directions. We have talked a lot about Maimonides at this time slot, and Maimonides represents the really rationalist side of this. Maimonides is a doctor and an astronomer and a philosopher, and he is Neoplatonist and Aristotelian, all of that sort of stuff. And this approach on Maimonides' part, I think, is in fact an opening to the mystics, because one of the things that Maimonides says is, rationally speaking, I can't describe God, right? God is infinite, and therefore God is beyond my understanding. We can't describe the divine. And therefore the mystics say, okay, then any of these stories that are about God, which Maimonides says are just in the heads of the prophets, right, are just in the dreams of the prophets, are not real, are accessible to us too. We get to think great thoughts about God from a metaphorical, symbolic purpose for the sake of teaching about how to get in touch with God. And so where Maimonides says, I'm going to create thought models that don't experiment with the nature of the divine because I'm talking about theories and absolutes, the mystics say, okay, we'll let you deal with the theories and absolutes. We're going to deal with the fun stuff, the stories that talk about God as caring and showing up and doing miracles. And because we can't really understand God, these are only symbolic. These are ways of engaging with the aspects of God that we experience. They don't say anything about the universe. They say something about our encounter with the universe. They don't tell us the absolute nature of mystery. They tell us how we feel about mystery and whether or not that feeling might help others encounter mystery too. So we can look at the philosophers as the theoreticians, the theoretical physicists of the time period, and the who are really attempting to explain the way astronomy works, right? They're the astrophysicists. They're looking at the mechanics of the world and they say, okay, this is the way things work, and there's all this mystery that we can't talk about. And then you've got the mystics, and the mystics are kind of talking to Stephen Hawking and saying, okay, so in theoretical physics, you can't actually describe what happens in the first milliseconds of the Big Bang. That means we can say whatever we want about it, and it might be true. So we're going to say whatever we want about those first milliseconds, about that time in the universe that we can't understand. We're going to admit that we don't understand it, but we're going to have fun with it anyway. And we're not actually going to be saying that this is the way the world works. We're just going to be saying that this is part of how I feel it works for me. Here, have a nice story. I hope it works for you too. In other words, what's interesting about this flourishing of Judaism and this sense that it all works or doesn't work is that no one is saying your Judaism, which I find to be totally crazy and dreamlike, is not Jewish. It's just yours. And two different dreamlike versions are okay. And they all fit into Maimonides' colossal worldview, because Maimonides is saying the prophets only dreamed about God anyway. And so it becomes this expansive idea about doing Jewish in a lot of different ways. So element one is Agadah, the interpretive Midrashic tradition. Now, that seems like enough. Like, we don't need much more to do a lot with Jewish mysticism. However, the mystics of the Zohar they are all in on every aspect of Judaism, right? They're in for creating as many different Jewish ways into mystery as possible. So here, the second element is the tradition of halakha, the legal and normative body of Talmudic teaching, the chief subject of study for Jews throughout the medieval era, and thus the main curriculum on which most Kabbalists themselves were educated. So this is important. If you're going to yeshiva in the Middle Ages, you're not studying legends, you're studying law. And the study of law abides by the same rules and tools as the study of legend and folklore. That is to say, we have the same interpretive rubrics. We use the same interpretive tools to create a legal argument. We're just not talking about Abraham and the breaking of idols. We're talking about how one observes don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And how one maintains that separation between meat and dairy, even though it doesn't say anywhere that one shouldn't have a cheeseburger in the Torah. It just says, don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. So how we get from that to then a waiting period between having a hamburger and having a milkshake is the stuff of Jewish legal discussion. And it again follows the same rules of interpretive tradition as everywhere else. And since these rules are the stuff of educated Jews, the Kabbalists are the ones who are trying to do this too. Okay, any questions before we move on? Because we've got a few more minutes.
So, Rabbi,
yes, Amaya.
Halakha looks so opposite of Agadah in a way, or not opposite, maybe more Talmudic, but more. Agadah can be everything, interpretation, while Halakha have to really be laws or rules that make sense.
Okay, well, let's. let's look at this from the perspective of Rabbi Green for a second, and hopefully he will explain, right? So Rabbi Green says, the early Kabbalists lived fully within the bounds of halakha and created a meaning system that justified its existence, while later Kabbalah, beginning in the early 14th century, contained some elements that are quite critical of halakha, of Jewish law. Little of this trend is evident in the period before the Zohar. In other words, part of the deal is they're expecting that living according to Jewish law will have a mystical dimension, that the Jewish legal system has deeper meaning, and the Kabbalists are operating within that system. Some transmitters of Kabbalah, Moses Nachmanides is the great example, were also active in the realm of halachic creativity, writing responsa and commentaries on Talmudic tractates. More common was a certain intellectual specialization, undoubtedly reflecting spiritual temperament, spawning Kabbalists who live faithfully within halakha, within Jewish law, and whose writings show its patterning of their lives, but who devoted their literary efforts chiefly to the realm of mystical exegesis, meaning mystical interpretation as opposed to halachic interpretation, including Kabbalistic comments on the commandments or on aspects of halachic practice. So this is the key, right? They're living in this system. And I think we're going to do elements 3 through 5 next time. But what I'd like to point out, and Amalia, you are right, our modern sensibility says steeping ourselves in folklore is contrary to steeping ourselves in Jewish legal theory, right? We identify these as, if not opposites, at least ends of a spectrum that almost have nothing to do with each other. And part of what we need to sort of shift in that regard is Judaism at its heart, I think, addresses the whole person. And we expect a whole person to be living in concert with community rules, and also out of fulfilling those community rules, having a more meaningful, deeper inner life too, that those are connected. Now, I could specialize. I could be somebody who, shows up for all the community stuff and abides by the community rules, but in my inner life, I'm doing more writing about my inner life and the mystical aspect and the folklore aspect. And that's okay. Or vice versa, right? I could be somebody who shows up to Jewish prayer services and does all that and has a meaningful inner life, but really what motivates me in my downtime, as it were, or in my specialty time, is to write about the details of Jewish law. And we need both aspects of that in our personality. We need to be people who are experimental rules followers, who are figuring out how to make the world better through the structure of society. Thank you, Lizanne. And we need people who are also deep thinkers who help create the profound meaning that enlivens that legal law-abiding society. Or to put it, to go back to something really relevant, we can't have scientists who just come up with weapons and don't also live in a society that figures out whether or not to use them, or whether or not the technology that allows us to create them should be used to create them. This was the question that Edward Teller was having in creating the hydrogen bomb. Is we had created an intense scientific community with no advanced moral grounding. There's no equivalent moral education for the PhD in physics. There's no equivalent moral education for the MBA. there's barely a moral education for an MD. And all of these aspects have moral, ethical, call them mystical groundings. How does my work impact a world filled with people who are also in the image of God? That's a fundamental ethical, mystical question that all of us should be asking, regardless of whether we are mystics or ethicists. And so what we see, Amalia, is really this, the modern and postmodern take on radical specialization. That I'm going to become an expert in this field, and by so doing, I'm going to come up with my own take on it, my field's take on everything, and I don't need to know anything about anything else. I'm a mechanical engineer. I don't need to know anything about philosophy. I'm a philosopher. I don't need to know anything about mechanical engineering. And the fact of the matter is that the world is so complicated and made more complicated every day that all of us need to have a generalist approach, no matter how specialized we are. Because all of us need to be educated patients when we go to the doctor. Right now, we all need to be, virologists. We need to figure out how to best judge the risk level for our families when some of us are vaccinated and some of us aren't. What does that look like? That's an ethical question and a scientific question, all of which is enhanced by whether or not we have a connection with our sense of deeper meaning. And the Jewish mystical path was an attempt to enhance, and we can, and the last thought for today, really, for me, is that we can draw a parallel between the radical explosion of information and ideas in the Middle Ages that led to the flowering of the Zohar, and the radical explosion of information in the 20th and 21st century. That currently there are more fields and more avenues of learning and study than any of us have ever encountered before. In the very short time between me finishing college in 1992 and 5 years ago, the biology department disappeared. Right. One can no longer major in biology. One can major in molecular biology or biochemistry or a specialized field in biology. There is no singular biology department. One can become, a zoologist or a marine biologist, but the marine biologists and the molecular biologists have nothing to talk about. They don't actually study the same field anymore. That happened in less time, in a time span shorter than the time between somebody being born and somebody going to college. That change took place, in the course of less than 20 years. So we're facing this question now. So why do we all want deeper meaning? Well, because it turns out there's a lot of stuff that we're not attending to. And it's clearly impacting us all in very practical, pragmatic ways. We're trying to figure out what to do about it.
Yes, thank you. Actually, you explained it very well because it's sort of I see it as a wholeness. You have to see the science part and the spiritual part, if I use today's words, is combined in order to be whole.
All right. Well, hopefully this wasn't too dry.
It was great.
And we'll continue on with elements 3, 4, and 5 when we next turn back to Kabbalah in 3 weeks. Next week, we're going back, I believe, to Talmud, right? Yes, I think so. And I look forward to seeing you all in a variety of ways. Wishing you all the best, and hope you had a good Purim as we head towards Pesach. Hard to believe, Pesach, less than a month away.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too.
Thank you, Jonathan.